We'll start this lesson off by asking the question, why virtual networks? Why do you need virtual networks, and what are they going to do for you? After all, you've already got a physical network with routers and switches and network cables. Why do you need a virtual network? Well, a virtual network is going to be fully self-contained inside your Hyper-V host. The virtual networks are made up of virtual network interface cards that are on each of your virtual machines, virtual switches, and uplinks. It's the virtual switches that are going to connect the virtual network interface cards of each virtual machine to the uplink, which is going to connect to the physical network. So think of a virtual switch as being the virtual counterpart of your existing physical switches. Again, they connect all the servers together, and they connect those servers to, let's say, the internet or a wide area network. Again, it's the virtual switch that connects the virtual machines on a Hyper-V host together. That virtual switch also switches Ethernet frames based on Ethernet MAC addresses, just like a physical switch would. The virtual switch connects the virtual machines to an uplink if you're using an external network, which I'll talk about in just a second. Virtual switches also offer advanced features such as ARP spoofing for security protection to ensure that none of your servers are being impersonated on the network, DHCP guard to ensure that another host isn't providing DHCP IP addresses that shouldn't be, port ACLs or access control lists to control what traffic is coming from a virtual machine's virtual network interface port, bandwidth limiting to ensure that particular virtual machines that have high priority applications get the bandwidth that they need, VLAN identification to allow your virtual switches to work with your existing physical VLAN infrastructure, and then a couple new features, SRIOV or single root I/O virtualization. This is an advanced feature for enterprises that need high performance direct access between a virtual machine and a physical Ethernet adapter. And it even allows multiple virtual machines to share that direct access by virtualizing their I/O to and from the virtual machine to the physical adapter on the Hyper-V host. And finally, extensibility, so that you can expand the functionality of your virtual network by adding virtual network security features, packet filtering features, and more. When you first go to create a new virtual switch, you'll find that there's 3 different types of virtual networks that virtual switch can be connected to. Those 3 types of networks that you need to know are external, internal, and private. Let's talk about them one at a time. The first type of virtual network in Hyper-V is the external virtual network, and this is by far the most common type of virtual network that Hyper-V admins create. With an external virtual network, you create a new virtual switch in Hyper-V, and then your virtual machine's virtual network adapters are connected to it. That virtual switch is also connected to an uplink to connect those virtual machines to the physical network. Here you see in this graphic a physical switch connected to a physical host out on the network. The big box, the big square there, represents the entire Hyper-V server. You see the physical network interface card in the server being connected to the virtual switch that you've created, and that virtual switch then connects to virtual network interface cards on each of your different virtual machines. It can even connect to network applications that are running on the Hyper-V host. So that's the external virtual network type. Again, the most common type of virtual network that Hyper-V admins create. The second type of virtual network is the internal virtual network. With this type of virtual network, all the virtual network traffic is fully contained inside the Hyper-V host. So here in the big box, we just have what's going on inside the Hyper-V host. You've got the virtual switch that you created connected to the virtual machine, virtual network adapters, and also connected to any network applications that are on the Hyper-V host. The third type of virtual network that you can create is the private virtual network. With the private virtual network, the virtual machines on the Hyper-V host are just connected to the virtual switch on that Hyper-V host. There's no communication to the Hyper-V server. You can't run networking applications on the Hyper-V server and communicate to the Hyper-V virtual machines, and the virtual machines, they can't talk to the host or to the physical network. A great use case for the private virtual network is if you want to create a virtual lab. For example, say you wanted to run an Active Directory domain controller here, maybe a DHCP server, maybe an Exchange server, file server. All these things could run on this Hyper-V host. They could work with each other, and they could have zero chance of impacting the physical network because they're not connected at all to the physical network. I want to give a special thanks to TechNet.com for these 3 excellent graphics that depict the Hyper-V virtual network types. So now let's go over to our Hyper-V host and get started creating each of these 3 different Hyper-V virtual networks. You'll find that it just takes a few clicks to create a new virtual network and virtual switch inside Hyper-V Manager. Here inside our Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V host, to configure virtual networks and virtual switches, what you'll do is bring up Hyper-V Manager, like I've done here, select the Hyper-V host on the left-hand side, go over to the Actions pane on the right-hand side, and click on the Virtual Switch Manager. Inside the Virtual Switch Manager, this is where you configure your virtual switches, as well as your global network settings. Now, the global network settings just allow you to make MAC address changes to the virtual switches, and that's not something that you would normally need to change, so most admins really never need to go into global network settings. Instead, most admins spend their time when they're in the Virtual Switch Manager underneath the Virtual Switches section. As you can see, we've already created one virtual switch, and it has the very long default name. We could give it a much better name, such as Management, to indicate its purpose, and then enter some notes here, such as WBC for Wired Brain Coffee Company Management Virtual Switch. That way, should another admin come in here and need to make some changes, they'd know the purpose of this virtual switch. If we expand out the virtual switch, we can go into extensions for this virtual switch. This is the extensibility of the new Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V virtual networking. This is where you would add additional features to the virtual network, such as network-based antivirus or packet filtering. Now, that's not something we're going to be doing in this lesson. Instead, let's go back here to the virtual switch that we have created, and first notice the connection type. We've got 3 different connection types here: external network, internal network, and private. Remember that we just talked about those back in the slides. So the external network is going to connect us to the physical network through the physical interface that we've selected here. Right now, the second interface is selected, the second Intel Pro Gig Ethernet network adapter on this physical server is connected to this management virtual switch. Notice how it says allow management operating system to share this network adapter. That means that the host operating system, the Windows 2012 server that has Hyper-V enabled, or host Hyper-V 1 in this case, can also use this physical network adapter for traditional Windows traffic. But it would be very easy to change this virtual switch to another type of connection, such as internal or private. Instead, we'll just create those types of new virtual switches in just a moment. This is where you would enable the VLAN ID for the management operating system, but that has nothing to do with the virtual machines that are connected to this virtual switch. Again, that's just for the host management traffic. We'll go ahead and uncheck that. We'll click Apply here. And at this point, we've renamed our switch and we've added some comments. Now let's go ahead and create a new virtual switch. I'll click here to create a new virtual network switch. And notice here's the 3 different types of virtual switches we can create again. We already have an external virtual switch that's used for management traffic. Let's go ahead and create another external virtual switch that'll just be used for production traffic with no host management traffic. I'll click Create Virtual Switch here. We'll give this virtual switch a name and call it Production. This will be for the Wired Brain Coffee Company Production VM Traffic. And we'll be connecting this new virtual switch to the other physical network adapter that's on this host. We'll disable the host to be able to use this virtual switch or this physical network adapter for management traffic. So this will just be for virtual machine traffic. I'll go ahead and click Apply there. And now it gives us a warning that the pending network configuration could prevent remote access to this host. Currently, we are connected to this host through remote desktop, so there may be a temporary interruption here. I'll say yes. All right, and with the changes applied, let's go ahead and create Now a private virtual switch. So I'll click New Virtual Network Switch. I'll select Private and click Create Virtual Switch. So this is going to be a private virtual switch. I'll enter that here. And the notes we'll enter here are that this is for Wired Brain Coffee Company private VM lab traffic. Notice here how the connection type is private, so this won't be able to communicate with the outside network, the Hyper-V host, or any of the other virtual machines running on this host unless you connect them to the private virtual switch. I'll click OK there. And now we have 3 different virtual switches on this host. We've got management traffic, which you can see here is an external network connection. Management traffic is allowed. We've got production virtual machine traffic going to a separate physical network adapter, and then we have a private virtual switch. So now let's look at the virtual machine we have configured on this host. If I select that virtual machine and go to Settings, then select the network adapter for that host, we can already tell here on the left-hand side, currently it's connected to the management virtual switch. Now this is going to be a production virtual machine, and it needs to be connected here to the production virtual switch. So I'll select production, I'll click Apply, and if there were production users using that virtual machine, there may have been a slight interruption or a temporary loss of network connectivity for just a couple seconds there while that virtual machine's virtual network adapter was moved from the management virtual switch to the production virtual switch. I could say OK here, and we would be all done. If we wanted to put this virtual machine on the private virtual lab network, we would just select that here and then say Apply or OK. And by the way, before we close out, you should note that it's inside the virtual machine's virtual network adapter that you configure the VLAN ID for this virtual machine to connect to if you're using VLANs in your network. You would check that box there and enter the VLAN identifier for this virtual machine to be connected to. It's also here that you would enable bandwidth management for this virtual machine to set minimum and maximum bandwidth levels. I'll go ahead and click Cancel here so we didn't make any changes. And at this point, we've successfully completed our task. We renamed the default virtual switch. We created a new external virtual switch to be used just for production traffic. And then we created a private virtual switch to be used just for private lab traffic for testing or development. So with that, let's go back to our slides. Now, before we wrap up this lesson, I want to review 3 key networking terms that you should know. The first one is virtual switch. Of course, we created virtual switches, and it's the virtual switch that connects the virtual machines to the uplinks to the physical network. The second one is virtual NIC. Each of your virtual machines can have one or more virtual network interface cards, and it's those virtual NICs that connect the virtual machine to the virtual switch and thus to the physical network, assuming you created an external networking type. Then finally, the 3 different types of virtual networks: internal, external, and private. Thanks for watching this lesson on configuring Hyper-V virtual networking.